It was just after midnight when the first sound came, a dull scrape at the back gate.
The street was quiet, the kind of suburban stillness where the only noise is the occasional hum of a distant car or the whisper of wind through trees.
But inside one particular home, an old man stirred. His instincts, sharpened through decades of service, didn't let him dismiss it as a raccoon or a restless branch. He knew the sound of intent. Someone was there, and they weren't friendly.
On that night, 3 young men, fueled by arrogance and adrenaline, moved like shadows across the backyard. To them, the house was nothing more than an easy payday. They'd picked it precisely because they thought it was low risk. A single-story home, occupied by a retiree, maybe someone with savings stashed in a drawer, maybe some valuables left lying around.
No wife, no kids, no barking dog to complicate the plan.
Just one old man. Easy. Or so they thought. The leader of the crew, a wiry figure with nervous energy spilling out of every movement, whispered orders. One carried a crowbar, another had a knife, and the third simply followed, his eyes darting nervously, as though even he felt the wrongness of what they were about to do. They approached the back door, confidence swelling.
The first strike of the crowbar against the frame echoed louder than they expected. Once, twice, and then a crack was splintered, and the door gave way.
Inside, the retired cop, let's call him Frank, didn't flinch. He'd been awake since the first scrape at the gate, already calculating.
His body wasn't as fast as it once was, but his mind was a steel trap.
Years of teaching FBI recruits had etched a permanent readiness into him.
He'd told his trainees countless times, when the moment comes, you won't have time to think.
Your act, your preparation will decide whether you live or die. Now, those words weren't just for them. They were for him. Frank moved with quiet purpose. He didn't grab a gun, though he had one locked away.
He didn't need it yet.
Instead, he slipped into the shadows of his own hallway, positioning himself where he could see without being seen. From there, he watched them enter.
3 figures, masks pulled tight, boots stomping on his floor as if they owned it.
They spoke in hurried whispers, trying to intimidate themselves as much as anyone else. But here's the thing about men who walk into a house they don't own. They're always louder than they think. Their nerves betray them. Their bravado cracks. Frank read every move like a playbook he'd memorized years ago. The way they spread out, the way they checked corners, even the way one of them kept glancing back toward the door as though ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble.
These weren't professionals. They were kids playing gangster.
Dangerous, yes, but unrefined.
He could have ambushed them right then. Years ago, maybe he would have.
But Frank had learned something that time alone can teach. Patience. Let them dig their own graves. Let them step further inside, overcommit, underestimate. That's when control shifts. The men whispered about valuables.
One mentioned finding a safe. Another muttered about shutting the old man up if he woke. That phrase was all Frank needed. It wasn't just a burglary anymore, it was a threat to his life. The line had been crossed. He stepped forward deliberately, letting the floorboards creak under his weight. The sound was subtle, but enough to freeze them. 3 heads snapped in his direction. For a moment, all they saw was a silhouette. An aging man in a simple shirt, calm, unarmed, standing as though he'd just wandered out of bed. And that's exactly what unnerved them, his calm.
Boys, Frank said, voice steady, you've made the biggest mistake of your lives. They laughed at first.
Nervous, mocking laughter.
To them, he was just some old guy trying to sound tough.
But there was something in his tone and authority they couldn't place that made them hesitate.
And hesitation, in moments like this, is deadly.
Frank didn't rush.
He didn't shout. He just started walking toward them, eyes locked on the leader.
I've trained men who could dismantle you in 5 seconds flat.
Do you know what they called me?
His voice lowered, each word sharp.
The man who taught the FBI how to fight. The bravado faltered. The leader's smirk slipped. His companions looked at him, uncertain now, their earlier swagger draining into unease.
Frank pressed the advantage.
He pointed casually at the crowbar. You grip that like a toy. You ever used it under real pressure?
Do you know how fast I can take it from you? And then he moved.
Faster than they expected.
His hand snapped out, knocking the crowbar aside before the leader could react. In one fluid motion, he twisted the young man's wrist and sent him sprawling.
The others froze, shocked at how quickly the old man had dismantled their strongest.
Still think I'm easy.
Frank's words cut through the tension like a blade. The one with the knife panicked, lunging forward.
But panic is sloppy.
Frank sidestepped, his hand clamping down on the boy's arm, twisting until the knife clattered to the floor.
A quick shove sent him stumbling back, clutching his wrist. The third one, the hesitant follower, dropped his mask entirely, fear written across his face.
He wanted no part of this.
But the danger wasn't over.
Fear makes men unpredictable. The leader scrambled up, humiliated, rage twisting his face. He charged, fists swinging wild.
Frank didn't meet him with fists.
Instead, he used the room. A quick step back, a shove into the edge of a table, a twist of balance, and the leader crashed down hard, air rushing out of his lungs.
For a brief moment, the house was silent again. Just 3 intruders, broken of their arrogance, staring at a man who had turned their perfect plan into a nightmare.
Frank stood tall, breathing steady.
He hadn't thrown a punch. He hadn't drawn a weapon. He hadn't needed to.
His presence alone was enough. The training, the composure, the knowledge that he was in complete control.
Here's how this is going to go, he said evenly.
You're going to sit right there until the police arrive.
And if any of you so much as twitch, I'll remind you exactly what I taught the men who hunt terrorists for a living.
Phones were dialed.
Sirens were called. And within minutes, the flashing lights lit up the quiet street. Officers stormed in, expecting chaos, maybe blood. What they found instead was 3 would-be predators subdued by a man old enough to be their grandfather sitting calm in his chair, as though the entire ordeal had been nothing more than an inconvenience.
Neighbors gathered, whispers spreading like wildfire. They'd always thought of Frank as the quiet retiree down the street.
No one had known the full story of the man in that little house. No one had realized that behind those calm eyes lived the experience of a warrior, a mentor, a trainer of the nation's finest. And as the gang members were hauled away, one officer leaned down to Frank and asked the obvious question, "How did you do it?"
Frank just smiled. "Son," he said quietly, "I've been preparing for this night my whole life."
Long before the break-in, before the headlines, before neighbors whispered about the retired man who subdued 3 intruders, there was simply a young boy who grew up with a sense of duty stitched into his bones. His name was Frank. He wasn't born a hero, nor did he dream of fame. What he wanted, even as a teenager, was simple: to protect. Frank grew up in a working-class neighborhood where kids learned responsibility early. His father worked long hours at a factory. His mother stitched clothes to help make ends meet. They didn't have much, but what they had was dignity. And they taught him that a man's worth wasn't measured in wealth, but in how he carried himself. His earliest lessons in honor didn't come from textbooks. They came from watching his father refuse to cut corners, even when money was tight, and from his mother's quiet resilience when life tested her. By the time he was old enough to think about a career, the world around him seemed restless. Crime rates were rising, and television news was filled with images of neighborhoods torn apart by drugs and violence. He saw kids from his block get pulled into gangs, saw neighbors lock their doors earlier each evening. Frank wanted none of that. He wanted to stand on the other side of the line, the side that held chaos back. When he first joined the police academy, Frank wasn't the strongest recruit. He wasn't the fastest either. But what set him apart was his mind. He studied every lesson twice, watched every instructor closely, and practiced until his body responded to commands without hesitation. He understood something many recruits didn't. The job wasn't about looking tough, it was about outthinking danger. The first years on the force weren't glamorous. Frank walked beats, wrote tickets, responded to noise complaints. But in those seemingly small tasks, he learned how communities breathe. He learned the rhythms of neighborhoods, the way people confided in officers they trusted, and the way fear crept into corners when law enforcement failed. Frank had a way with people. He listened more than he spoke, and in a profession often criticized for its hard edges, that made him stand out. People talked to him. He remembered names, faces, and small details that built trust. To the community, he wasn't just a badge. He was someone who saw them. It wasn't long before his superiors noticed. While others rushed to prove themselves with arrests, Frank was proving himself by preventing crimes before they happened. His reports were thorough, his instincts sharp, and when situations turned violent, something remarkable emerged: a calmness under fire. There was one incident early in his career that would later define him. A domestic disturbance call had escalated, guns drawn, tempers flaring. Younger officers on the scene panicked, shouting commands, escalating tension. But Frank stepped forward, his voice low. steady. He didn't yell. He spoke as though he were talking to an old friend. Minutes later, a man who could have turned into another statistic laid down his weapon. No shots fired, no blood spilled. That was Frank's way. De-escalation before confrontation. Control through presence. He believed violence should always be the last resort, not the first. By the time he was 10 years into his career, Frank's reputation had spread beyond his precinct. Training officers began requesting him to speak to new recruits. "Show them how you do it," they'd say. At first, he resisted. He still saw himself as a beat cop, not a teacher. But the moment he stepped in front of a classroom, he realized something. He wasn't just good at handling danger, he was good at explaining it. He could break down complex tactical decisions into simple lessons. He could show rookies how to read body language, how to notice the flicker of fear in a suspect's eyes, how to use tone and posture to command respect without ever drawing a weapon. His lessons weren't about brawn, they were about brains. "A fight avoided is a fight won," he'd tell them. And slowly, his methods started shaping the next generation of officers. But Frank's work didn't stop there. He volunteered for specialized units, working nights, weekends, even holidays. He learned surveillance techniques, crowd control, and eventually counterterrorism tactics. His hunger to learn never faded. Where some officers plateaued, Frank climbed higher. It was during a high-risk raid, years later, that his calm under fire reached new heights. An armed suspect had barricaded himself inside a warehouse, threatening to kill hostages. SWAT surrounded the building, nerves frayed. The standoff stretched into hours. Then, when tempers threatened to break, Frank did something unthinkable. He volunteered to negotiate face-to-face. Colleagues thought he was reckless, but Frank saw it differently. He walked into the lion's den unarmed, talking as though he had all the time in the world. He drew on every lesson from his youth, his father's dignity, his mother's quiet strength, his years of listening. Hours later, the suspect surrendered. The hostages walked free. That moment didn't just earn him medals. It earned him a reputation. Word spread beyond the city. Federal eyes took notice. And eventually, the call came. The FBI wanted him. Not to join, but to train. They saw in Frank what few possessed. Not just courage, but the ability to teach courage. When he accepted, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. He went from the streets to classrooms filled with agents destined for the most dangerous assignments in America. He was no longer just Officer Frank. He became Mentor Frank, the man who would shape warriors for the nation's most elite force. Looking back, Frank never saw himself as extraordinary. To him, it was just service. One day after another, one lesson after another. But those who trained under him, those who walked into fire because of his guidance, remembered him differently. They remembered a man who embodied calm in chaos, discipline in disorder, and humanity in a profession that too often lost it. And that is the story that led him to retirement, not out of weakness, but out of having given everything he had. By the time he hung up his badge, Frank had influenced more lives than he could ever count. Yet even in retirement, even when the uniform was gone, his service wasn't truly over. Because that night, when 3 men broke into his home, they weren't just facing an old man. They were facing the sum of a life dedicated to service, a man whose instincts had been forged in fire, whose patience had been honed in classrooms, and whose courage had been tested on streets and in standoffs. The gang thought they had found a victim. What they had found instead was a life of service, standing unbroken in the quiet shadows of a suburban home. Every great mentor begins with a single step forward, usually without realizing where it will lead. For Frank, that step wasn't taken inside a classroom, but out on the street, where the rhythm of daily policing shaped his instincts. At first, he was just a beat cop, patrolling sidewalks, checking alleyways, responding to calls that ranged from petty thefts to neighborhood disputes. Yet even then, something about him was different. Other officers sometimes looked at patrol as a stepping stone, a temporary phase before moving on to more serious assignments. But Frank treated every shift like it mattered. He knew that what happened on the ground floor of policing, the handshakes, the arguments, the quiet interventions, set the tone for everything else. And it was during those long hours that he began developing the habits that would one day turn him into a mentor. Frank was observant. He noticed patterns others missed. A kid loitering outside a liquor store wasn't always casing it. Sometimes he was just looking for an excuse to avoid going home. A man pacing a block wasn't always up to no good. Sometimes he was rehearsing how to ask for help. Frank never assumed. He asked, and by asking, he learned. One night early in his career, he responded to a call about a suspected burglary. When he arrived, he found a nervous teenager crouched behind a grocery store, a half-empty backpack at his feet. Any other cop might have cuffed him on the spot. But Frank paused. He noticed the boy's shoes, falling apart, barely tied. He noticed the backpack wasn't filled with stolen goods, but with food, loaves of bread, cans of beans, apples. Frank didn't excuse the crime, but he also didn't treat the boy like a hardened criminal. He spoke to him like a human being, asked him why. The kid broke down and admitted he was stealing to feed his younger siblings. Instead of throwing him straight into the system, Frank called a local outreach worker he knew, someone who could help. That moment stuck with Frank, not because he'd bent the rules, but because he'd seen firsthand how mentorship, guiding rather than punishing, could change the course of a life. His approach caught the eye of his superiors. Slowly, they began asking him to ride along with rookies, to show them how things were done. At first, he thought it was just routine pairing, but then he noticed a pattern. They weren't sending him partners to help him. They were sending him partners so he could help them. One rookie in particular, nervous and hot-headed, struggled with keeping his cool under pressure. During a heated confrontation with a drunk suspect, the rookie's hand hovered too long on his weapon. Frank calmly placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Watch his eyes, not his mouth. He's scared, not aggressive." Sure enough, within minutes, the drunk had calmed down and the situation ended without violence. The rookie, wide-eyed, asked Frank afterward, "How did you know?" Frank's answer was simple. "Because I listened with more than my ears." That line would echo through his career. Frank wasn't just policing, he was teaching every single day. Eventually, the department made it official. Frank was asked to join the training division. At first, he resisted. He loved the streets, the raw reality of it. But then he realized something powerful. Training wasn't leaving the field. Training was multiplying himself. Every recruit he shaped carried a piece of him into their work. Every officer he mentored became an extension of his influence. And that ripple effect could protect more lives than he ever could alone. Stepping into the classroom was a new kind of battlefield. Young recruits came in full of bravado, some cocky, some terrified. Frank learned to break them down, not to humiliate them, but to strip away illusions. He taught them that the badge wasn't a shield to hide behind, but a responsibility that demanded humility. He became known for his unusual exercises. Instead of only drilling physical techniques, he focused on observation. He'd walk into class, stand silently at the front, and after 10 seconds ask, "What did you notice?" Most would shrug. A few might say something obvious, like the color of his shirt. Then Frank would point out what they'd missed, the way he favored one leg, the fact that his shoelace was untied, the folded paper sticking out of his pocket. "Details save lives," he'd tell them. "If you don't see them, you'll miss the warning signs that danger is coming." Recruits groaned at his intensity, but they respected it. More importantly, they remembered it. Years later, officers would admit that Frank's lessons had saved them on the streets. But Frank wasn't just shaping tactics, he was shaping character. He demanded integrity. "Anyone can wear a uniform," he told them, "but not everyone deserves to." He drilled into them that cutting corners or letting ego drive decisions would get people killed. He'd share stories of mistakes he'd seen, officers who escalated when they should have de-escalated, officers who ignored instincts until it was too late. His honesty struck nerves, but it also instilled caution. In time, Frank developed a reputation as a mentor who wasn't easy, but was unforgettable. He didn't sugarcoat reality. He didn't tell recruits what they wanted to hear. He told them what they needed to hear. And because of that, the officers who left his classroom weren't just better prepared, they were better people. Word of his effectiveness spread. His department's crime response rates improved. Fewer rookie mistakes were being made in the field. And eventually, word traveled beyond city lines. Other agencies began requesting Frank's recruits. They wanted officers shaped by his methods. It was around this time that Frank faced a turning point. A visiting federal training officer observed one of his classes and was stunned by the impact. He pulled Frank aside afterward and said, "What you're doing here, it's bigger than this department. You ever think about teaching on a national scale?" Frank brushed it off at first. He wasn't chasing titles or recognition. But the seed had been planted, and not long after the call came from the FBI. They wanted him, not as an agent in the field, but as a trainer for their most elite. They needed someone who could cut through the noise, someone who could teach agents not just how to shoot, but how to think. When Frank accepted, it was both an honor and a challenge. He went from mentoring local officers to shaping federal agents who would one day face terrorists, organized crime syndicates, and international threats. It was the culmination of everything he'd learned, every beat he'd walked, every call he'd answered, every recruit he'd guided. But even as he stepped into that role, Frank never forgot his roots. He wasn't a man molded by politics or prestige. He was a beat cop who became a mentor because he never stopped caring. And that humility is what made his teaching resonate at every level, from the greenest rookie to the toughest federal operative. Looking back, Frank often said his proudest moments weren't the arrests he made or the medals he earned. They were the letters he received years later from officers who wrote things like, "Your lesson saved my life," or "I heard your voice in my head, and it stopped me from pulling the trigger." That was the legacy of a beat cop turned mentor. Not just protecting lives himself, but teaching others how to do it better, smarter, and with humanity intact. And it was that legacy, those decades of shaping warriors, that set the stage for what would come next. The moment when the FBI came calling, and Frank's influence would stretch far beyond any single city. By the late 1980s, Frank had already made his mark in local law enforcement. His recruits were sharper, calmer under pressure, and more respected on the streets than most. Departments from neighboring counties began quietly asking, "Can you send us one of Frank's guys?" His methods weren't flashy. They weren't about brute force or cinematic takedowns. But they worked. And in the world of law enforcement, results spoke louder than anything else. It wasn't long before word traveled further than he ever imagined. An FBI field agent, attending a joint training seminar, watched Frank run a session on tactical awareness. The room was filled with officers who thought they'd seen it all. But Frank had a way of stripping them down, making even veterans realize how much they'd missed. He would walk into a mock scenario, stand silently for 30 seconds, then turn to the class and ask, "What did you see?" Most would mutter generalities. A man standing, a room with a desk. Then Frank would list off everything they'd overlooked. The tension in the man's shoulders, the odd angle of his stance, the way his right hand hovered near his pocket, the glint of something metallic by the chair leg. Suddenly, everyone in the room realized how blind they had been. The FBI agent left that seminar shaken, not by Frank's intimidation, but by his clarity. 2 weeks later, Frank got a phone call. A polite but firm voice introduced itself as Special Agent Robert Hensley from the FBI Academy in Quantico. "We'd like you to come down and run a session with our recruits," Hensley said. At first, Frank thought it was a prank. Why would the Bureau, an organization known for its rigid hierarchy and polished programs, Want a street cop from a mid-sized city to teach their people. But it was no joke. The invitation was real, and it was the beginning of something far larger than Frank ever expected. When he arrived at Quantico, Frank carried no illusions. He expected skepticism, and he got it. Some of the instructors, men in pressed suits with long resumes, looked him over like he didn't belong. To them, he was an outsider, gritty, unpolished, too local for a place that prided itself on producing agents for the highest levels of federal service. But Frank didn't care about optics. He was there to teach. The first day, he walked into a room full of young FBI recruits, men and women who had survived grueling physical tests, psychological evaluations, and background checks that would intimidate anyone. They were smart. They were tough. But Frank noticed something almost immediately. They were also overconfident. Many assumed that because they wore the Bureau's crest, they were already prepared for anything. Frank smiled at that. He knew arrogance was the most dangerous blind spot of all. He opened his session with a simple statement. The badge doesn't protect you. Your mind does. And if you can't think under fire, this job will eat you alive. The room fell silent. It wasn't what they expected. They thought he'd start with tactical jargon or some dramatic story of glory in the field. Instead, he cut to the core. Then he gave them a scenario. He staged a mock interrogation. Sitting across from him was a seasoned instructor playing the role of a suspect. Most recruits asked basic questions, trying to force answers. Frank, however, leaned in calmly, adjusted his tone, mirrored the suspect's body language, and within minutes had the man spilling details without even realizing it. When the exercise ended, the room erupted in murmurs. Woo! Frank explained, "Force is clumsy. Patience is surgical. If you can't control the room with your presence, you'll end up fighting for scraps with your fists." That was the moment the room shifted. Skepticism turned to respect. Even the polished instructors began to take notes. Over the next few days, Frank introduced methods the Bureau had rarely emphasized. He taught situational awareness drills, where recruits had to recall dozens of details after brief exposures. He ran stress exercises that pushed them into controlled chaos, alarms blaring, lights flashing, conflicting instructions, while demanding they stay calm and make precise decisions. And he introduced psychological tactics, showing how body language and tone could neutralize violence before it erupted. By the end of his first week at Quantico, the instructors who had doubted him were asking when he could come back. The FBI didn't just tolerate his unpolished, street-level wisdom, they craved it. Soon, Frank became a regular presence. He wasn't a full-time Bureau employee, he preferred to stay rooted in his own community. But the FBI flew him in repeatedly to run specialized sessions. Agents in training began speaking of him with a kind of reverence. They called him the ghost cop, the man who could see things no one else noticed. But what truly cemented Frank's place was an event that happened during a high-level training scenario. The FBI had staged a hostage simulation in an abandoned building. Teams of recruits stormed in, weapons drawn, shouting commands. It was loud, chaotic, full of energy. But Frank, observing from the shadows, shook his head. When the exercise ended with hostages rescued but half the team killed in the simulation, he stood before the recruits and said, "Congratulations, you got the job done, but you got half your team killed doing it. That's not victory, that's failure." The recruits bristled. They weren't used to being called out like that, but Frank wasn't finished. He walked them back through the simulation, pointing out every mistake, the way they funneled through a single door, the way no one checked blind corners, the way their shouting gave away positions. Then he replayed the scenario with his guidance. This time the team moved quietly, methodically, covering each other's angles. And when it ended, no one was dead. That lesson rippled through Quantico. Agents later admitted that Frank's voice echoed in their heads during real operations. One agent, years later, would write him a letter from overseas. "I'm alive today because I remembered your words. I slowed down, I thought, and it saved my team." For Frank, it wasn't about glory. It wasn't about headlines. He didn't brag about teaching the FBI. To him, it was all just an extension of what he'd always done. Train others to be sharper, calmer, more prepared than they thought possible. But for the Bureau, his presence was transformative. They had found in Frank a rare mix, the streetwise instincts of a cop who had seen it all, and the patience of a teacher who knew how to shape raw recruits into warriors. By the time he stepped away from active duty, Frank had left an indelible mark on the FBI. He had trained agents who would go on to dismantle criminal empires, rescue hostages, and disrupt terrorist plots. His influence stretched far beyond his city, far beyond his state. Quietly, without seeking recognition, he had become part of the backbone of America's most elite force. And yet, when he retired, he didn't carry that reputation with him like a badge of honor. He went home. He tended his garden. He waved at neighbors. To the people on his street, he was just the old man with the kind smile. They never knew that behind that quiet life stood the man who had trained the best of the best. Which is why, on that night when 3 gang members broke into his home, they had no idea who they were dealing with. They weren't facing just a retiree. They were facing the man who had once sharpened the FBI itself into a weapon.
Training an FBI agent wasn't about molding soldiers. It was about forging warriors. Soldiers are told where to go and what to do. Warriors think for themselves, anticipate, adapt, and overcome, even when the script collapses. Frank understood that difference better than most, and it became the foundation of his philosophy. When Frank first stepped into Quantico's training grounds, he noticed something immediately. The emphasis was on technique, not instinct. Agents were drilled on weapons handling, arrest procedures, and tactical maneuvers. It was precise, almost surgical. But Frank saw a gap. The field precision alone wasn't enough. Life and death situations rarely unfolded like training manuals. They were messy, unpredictable, and cruelly unfair. He believed that unless an agent could think under pressure, the rest didn't matter. So, he tore apart the idea that training had to look clean. Sessions were chaotic by design. He'd blast sirens, set off smoke, and give conflicting instructions. He'd throw curveballs at recruits mid-drill, like shouting that a child had entered the scene, or that a civilian had collapsed behind them. When agents complained that it was unrealistic, he shook his head. "You think criminals are going to give you a fair fight?" he'd ask. "Oh. You think terrorists are going to wait until you're ready? If you can't think when the world falls apart, you don't belong in that world." One of his most famous exercises was called the blind walk. He'd line up recruits, blindfold them, and lead them into an unfamiliar space, sometimes a warehouse, sometimes a forest trail. They'd stumble, frustrated, trying to orient themselves. Then Frank would tell them to stop. "Listen," he'd say. "Feel the ground. Awareness isn't just what you see. It's everything your senses give you." Hours later, when the blindfolds came off, many admitted they noticed more without their eyes than they ever had with them. Another drill he introduced was the split second. Recruits would be given only fragments of information about a scenario and incomplete 911 call. A vague description of a suspect then shoved into action with no time to plan. Frank wanted them to learn to make decisions in the fog of uncertainty. Sometimes they got it right, sometimes they failed spectacularly. But every failure was a lesson. "Better you fail here, where no one dies," he'd tell them, "than out there, where hesitation costs blood." What made Frank's methods powerful wasn't just their toughness, but their humanity. He didn't train agents to be robots. He trained them to be human beings who understood fear, stress, and compassion. He insisted on empathy. Drills where agents role-played not just as officers, but as civilians, suspects, even victims. He wanted them to feel the weight of being on the other side of the badge. "If you don't understand fear," he said, "you'll never know how to calm it in others." There was resistance, of course. Some recruits thought his exercises were excessive. Some instructors felt he was straying too far from traditional doctrine. But then came the results. Agents who trained under Frank performed better in the field. They made fewer rash decisions, de-escalated conflicts more often, and worked as a unit rather than as individuals seeking glory. The Bureau couldn't argue with results. Frank's reputation grew. He wasn't just training, he was transforming. Soon, his methods weren't confined to classrooms, they spread to field offices across the country. Agents began sharing Frank's rules like gospel. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. If you control the room, you control the threat. Listen to what isn't said. Your weapon is your last resort, not your first. Fear is contagious. So is calm. Choose which one you spread. These phrases, simple but profound, became mantras in FBI circles. What struck many agents most wasn't Frank's authority, but his humility. He never pretended to be infallible. In fact, he often shared his own mistakes. Moments where he hesitated, where his assumptions nearly got him or others hurt. He told those stories not to shame himself, but to remind recruits that even the best stumble. The difference between the living and the dead, he said, isn't perfection, it's learning. One memorable session came when a recruit froze during a hostage drill. Instructors were ready to fail him on the spot. But Frank stopped them. He walked over, knelt in front of the terrified young agent, and said softly, "You're not failing because you're scared. You're scared because you care. That's good. But now you've got to turn care into action. Fear won't go away. You've got to carry it with you and move anyway." That recruit would later become one of the FBI's most decorated crisis negotiators. Frank believed warriors weren't born in moments of triumph. They were built in moments of doubt. And he gave recruits permission to face those doubts, to acknowledge fear without letting it own them. Outside the academy, word spread further. Military units began sending observers. International law enforcement agencies requested access to his techniques. Some even asked him to travel overseas to advise on counterterrorism training. Frank never sought the spotlight, but his influence stretched across borders. Yet for all the accolades, he remained grounded, still lived in his modest home, still mowed his own lawn, still sat on his porch waving at neighbors. If you asked him about his achievements, he'd shrug and say, "I just taught people to see what was already in them." To Frank, building warriors wasn't about crafting superhumans. It was about unlocking the potential for courage and clarity that already existed in ordinary people. And perhaps that's why his story resonates so powerfully, because the same instincts that saved him during the break-in weren't born in a single night. They were the product of decades spent building others. In shaping warriors, Frank had sharpened himself, even in retirement. And when predators finally tested him, they weren't just facing an old man, they were facing the living embodiment of every warrior he'd ever trained.
If you asked Frank what the single most important trait of a warrior was, he wouldn't say strength. He wouldn't say speed or even intelligence. He'd say discipline. Without it, strength becomes reckless, speed becomes sloppy, and intelligence turns arrogant. Discipline, he believed, was the steel spine that kept everything else standing. Frank had learned this lesson the hard way, long before he ever taught it. In his early days on the force, he'd watched fellow officers lose their composure in the heat of a chase, barreling through streets without thinking, escalating confrontations with too much adrenaline and too little patience. Those moments rarely ended well. Sometimes an innocent person was hurt. Sometimes an officer overstepped. And sometimes lives were lost because chaos had taken over. Frank never forgot those failures. They etched into him a simple truth. Without discipline, courage is just recklessness in disguise. When he began training recruits, he made discipline the foundation of everything. From day one, he hammered it into them that skill without control was dangerous. He wasn't interested in seeing how fast they could run or how many push-ups they could do. He wanted to know if they could stay calm when everything around them screamed panic. One of his earliest lessons at Quantico was what he called the wait. Recruits were told to prepare for a high-intensity drill. They suited up, adrenaline pumping, expecting sirens, simulated gunfire, chaos. But then Frank would keep them waiting. 10 minutes, 30, an hour. The tension built, nerves frayed. Some grew impatient, muttering under their breath. Others fidgeted, pacing like caged animals. And when he finally launched the drill, without warning, without mercy, it wasn't their bodies that failed them, it was their lack of patience. They stumbled, miscalculated, fired too soon or too late. Afterward, Frank would gather them in silence and ask, "Do you understand now? Discipline isn't just about doing what you're told, it's about mastering yourself, even when you want to break. The world doesn't run on your schedule, neither will danger." Another exercise became infamous among his recruits: the cold room. He'd take trainees into a dim, frigid warehouse, their breath fogging in the air. The task was simple: hold position for hours with minimal movement, observing every detail, recording changes no one else noticed. Boredom gnawed at them, discomfort grew unbearable. Some shifted constantly, desperate for relief, but Frank taught them that discipline meant endurance. "You think fights are all action?" he asked. "Most of the job is waiting, watching, listening, resisting the urge to move before it's time. Discipline is surviving the silence." It wasn't just physical endurance he drilled, it was emotional control. He knew fear could shatter a person's mind faster than any bullet. So he introduced scenarios designed to push recruits into panic. Loud noises, sudden surprises, even deliberate failures where no matter what they did, the outcome was grim. Afterward, when their hands shook and their voices cracked, he didn't shame them. He reminded them, fear is natural. What matters is discipline. What you do with fear, whether you let it command you or you command it. Frank often told a story from his own career, one that shaped him more than he liked to admit. Years earlier, he had been involved in a hostage standoff at a corner store. The suspect was frantic, waving a gun, threatening to kill anyone who moved. Young officers on the scene were itching to storm the place, desperate to end it quickly. Frank held them back. Hours passed. Negotiations dragged. Some called him too cautious. But Frank refused to break. Finally, the suspect collapsed under the weight of his own panic and surrendered. No shots fired, no lives lost. Frank told recruits, "It wasn't tactics that saved those people, it was discipline. The discipline to wait when your blood is screaming at you to act." He also taught discipline in speech. "Words are weapons," he'd say. "Use them without control, and you start wars. Use them with discipline, and you end them before they begin." Recruits practiced speaking under stress, controlling tone, volume, and phrasing when adrenaline made them want to shout. They learned that a calm voice could diffuse a room faster than any drawn weapon. What made Frank's lessons unforgettable wasn't just the drills, but the way he lived them. Recruits saw that he practiced what he preached. He never raised his voice unnecessarily, never rushed a decision, never let pride steer his judgment. In moments where tempers flared among trainees, Frank's composure was unshakable. That steadiness became a model they unconsciously absorbed. Agents who went through his training later said discipline was the skill that saved them most often. One agent recalled being pinned down in a firefight overseas. Panic spread through his team. But he remembered Frank's voice. "Slow is smooth, smooth is fast." He forced his breathing steady, took deliberate aim, and led his team out alive. Another agent described a domestic terrorism case where hours of surveillance stretched into days of monotony. Many wanted to pull out early, convinced nothing would happen. But discipline, holding the line despite the boredom, paid off. Their patience revealed the suspect's movements, preventing an attack. That agent admitted, "We only stayed because I could still hear Frank telling us discipline was survival." Discipline, Frank taught, wasn't about rigidity. It wasn't blind obedience. It was about choice. The choice to act when it was right, not when it was easy. The choice to stay calm when chaos begged you to crack. The choice to put duty above ego, service above pride. And when the night came, years later, when 3 intruders burst into his home, it wasn't just instinct or training that saved him. It was discipline. The discipline not to rush for his gun. The discipline to watch, to read their mistakes, to wait for the right moment. Discipline kept his hands steady, his voice firm, his mind sharp. That was Frank's greatest gift to those he trained and to himself. The understanding that discipline wasn't just a lesson for the academy, it was a way of life. And in that way, even in the quiet of his retirement, discipline never left him. When Frank finally hung up his badge, it wasn't because he had grown tired of service. It was because he had given every ounce of himself to it. For decades, his life had been defined by long nights, dangerous calls, and the weight of responsibility for those he trained. But even the strongest warriors eventually need rest. Retirement, to most people, meant slowing down. To Frank, it meant shifting gears. He didn't picture himself lounging on beaches or chasing hobbies with reckless abandon. Instead, he wanted something quieter. A small house, a tidy yard, and the freedom to wake each morning without the burden of someone else's emergency pressing against his chest. So he chose a modest home in a quiet suburb. It wasn't the biggest, nor the fanciest. It was ordinary, deliberately so. The kind of place where neighbors waved from their driveways, kids played catch in the street, and the loudest sound at night was a passing train in the distance. To Frank, that normalcy felt like luxury. After years of chaos, peace had value. Yet peace never meant complacency. Even in retirement, Frank's habits stayed with him. He rose early, the way he always had, long before the sun stretched across the horizon. He brewed strong coffee, read the paper cover to cover, and made mental notes of local events. His morning walks weren't just for exercise. They were quiet patrols. He noticed which houses had new locks, which cars parked where, which families were leaving early for work. Neighbors thought he was just being friendly when he asked questions about their routines. In reality, he was mapping his environment, cataloging details the way he always had. Inside his home, he lived simply. A shelf held photographs from his career. Smiling recruits, handshakes with colleagues, plaques gathering dust. He never displayed them for bragging rights. They were reminders, markers of time spent in service. On the wall hung a single-framed quote that had guided him through every chapter of his life. Discipline is freedom. But though he had earned the quiet, Frank never fully believed in retirement from purpose. He volunteered occasionally at the local community center, speaking to troubled youth about choices. He'd never reveal the full extent of his past. No boasting about FBI training, no tales of hostage negotiations. Instead, he told them simple truths, that the small choices stacked into big ones, and that fear, disguised as pride, ruined more lives than bullets ever did. Some kids listened. Others rolled their eyes. But Frank kept showing up because he knew seeds take time to grow. His neighbors saw him as the kind old man who always seemed to know when someone needed help. He'd lend a ladder, mow a lawn for a widow, fix a squeaky door for the single mother down the block. No one suspected that behind his easy smile lived the instincts of a man who had once trained America's elite. They didn't know that when he fixed their hinges, he also checked their locks. That when he watered his garden, he also studied patterns of unfamiliar cars. To them, Frank was just Mr. F. Quiet, reliable, maybe a little too observant, but harmless. And for a while, life really did slow down. He found comfort in the little things. Saturday morning trips to the farmer's market. Afternoons tending to his rose bushes. Evenings spent with a book and a glass of whiskey. Jazz humming low in the background. After years of rushing from one crisis to the next, the rhythm of ordinary days was healing. Still, there were moments when his past tugged at him. A siren in the distance would make his shoulders tense. A news story about violence would stir memories of faces, officers he trained, suspects he confronted, moments when lives balanced on a thread. Sometimes he'd wake in the night, heart pounding, expecting the radio to crackle with a call for backup. Then he'd remember. There was no call. The world wasn't waiting for him anymore. And in those moments, he'd sit by the window, breathing steady, reminding himself that letting go was its own kind of discipline. But here's the thing about men like Frank. They never truly stop preparing. He still practiced small drills without even thinking. Walking into his house, he always locked the door twice. Sitting in a chair, he made sure his back was never fully to the window. If he dropped his keys, he'd pick them up without bending fully, keeping his eyes level, scanning. Little habits, invisible to most, but second nature to him. Friends who visited would laugh when they saw how meticulously organized his home was. Tools aligned by size, emergency supplies tucked neatly away, flashlights checked regularly. "You're retired," they'd tease. "Loosen up a little." Frank would just smile and say, "Old habits keep old men alive." He wasn't paranoid. He didn't live in fear. He simply understood that safety is built in the ordinary moments long before danger arrives. And in that quiet suburb, danger felt distant. But fate, as it often does, doesn't respect the illusion of peace. Because on one ordinary night, when the roses were watered, the whiskey glass rinsed, and the lights dimmed, danger came crashing back into Frank's life. Only this time, it wasn't in a foreign city, or a training simulation, or a tense standoff miles away. It was right there, in his own living room. 3 gang members, hungry for easy money, thought they had found a harmless target in the quiet old man's house. They saw a modest home, a retiree, a vulnerability. What they didn't see was the warrior beneath the calm exterior. What they didn't realize was that even in retirement, Frank's discipline hadn't retired with him. And when that door splintered under their crowbar, Frank didn't face them as a helpless victim. He faced them as the sum of every lesson, every drill, every life he had shaped. Retirement hadn't dulled him, it had sharpened him in silence. And the intruders were about to discover that predators who mistake discipline for weakness rarely survive the encounter. To the people on Maplewood Drive, Frank was more of a background presence than anything else. He was the man with the tidy yard, the polite nod at the mailbox, the neighbor who always had time to hold a door or carry a bag of groceries for someone struggling. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, and he certainly wasn't the type to brag about his past. In fact, most of his neighbors didn't even know he had worn a badge at all. To them, he was just the watchful old man at the corner house. Every neighborhood has one, a figure you wave to without really knowing. Someone steady, predictable, almost invisible in their consistency. But Frank's version of invisibility was deliberate. He liked blending in. He liked being underestimated. It was freedom in its purest form. Yet while others saw a retiree living a simple life, Frank's habits told a different story. His morning walks weren't casual strolls. They were quiet surveys of his environment. He noticed which houses left lights on when families went away, which fences had loose boards, which cars didn't belong. He memorized the rhythms of the street, not out of nosiness, but out of instinct. To him, awareness was survival, and even in a neighborhood wrapped in comfort, danger could always find a way in. People often joked that Frank was the unofficial neighborhood watch. Mrs. Gardner across the street once told him, "If anything ever happens, I know you'll see it before the rest of us do." He'd smile and shrug, never confirming, never denying. But deep down, she was right. Frank noticed everything. When teenagers started spray painting the old utility shed by the park, it wasn't the police who spotted them first. It was Frank. He didn't confront them with anger or threats. He walked up calmly, hands in his pockets, and said, "Boys, let me tell you something about choices." They rolled their eyes, muttered excuses, but something in his tone, firm yet oddly understanding, stuck. The graffiti stopped within a week. When a neighbor's house was nearly broken into while they were on vacation, Frank was the one who had written down the suspicious car's license plate days before. Police later traced it to a crew hitting houses across the county. Quietly, without fanfare, Frank had protected his street again. Still, no one knew the depth of his vigilance. No one knew that he positioned his favorite chair in the living room to give him a clear line of sight to both the front door and the back window. No one knew he had mentally mapped every entry point into his house, or that he practiced subtle drills, moving through rooms silently, checking blind spots like he had done 1,000 times in training. To his neighbors, he was simply cautious. To Frank, he was always ready. The children on the block adored him. They'd wave when they biked past his porch, sometimes daring to ask for stories. He never told them about FBI drills or standoffs with armed men. Instead, he told simple lessons disguised as anecdotes. "You know why the turtle lives so long?" he once asked a curious boy. "Because it's patient. It doesn't rush, it doesn't panic. That's how it wins." The boy laughed, thinking it was just about animals. Frank knew better. He was planting seeds. Parents trusted him. On summer evenings, when kids played kickball in the cul-de-sac, they felt safer knowing Frank was sitting outside, sipping iced tea, watching quietly. He never interfered, never imposed, but everyone knew he noticed. If a stranger's car lingered too long, Frank's eyes tracked it. If a delivery man seemed suspicious, Frank remembered his face. What the neighborhood didn't see, though, was the other side of his watchfulness, the loneliness that often came with it. Frank had outlived comrades, seen families break apart, watched recruits he trained scatter across the country. His life had been built around service, and now in the quiet suburb, he sometimes felt like a soldier without a war. He filled that gap by watching over others quietly, without asking for thanks. Protecting was the only way he knew how to live. And so in time, Frank became part of the neighborhood's fabric, not through words, but through presence. He was the one who shoveled snow for the elderly widow next door, the one who noticed when a teenager was sneaking out too often and gently told his parents not to shame him, but to keep him safe. The one who picked up stray trash on the sidewalks and fixed the park-ass broken bench when no one else bothered. The irony was that for all his vigilance, for all the lives he touched quietly, no one truly knew him. Not really. They knew kindness, steadiness, and reliability. But they didn't know the man who had walked into hostage standoffs, who had trained federal agents to keep their hands steady under fire. They didn't know the warrior who lived in silence behind those calm eyes. To them, Frank was a watchman. To himself, he was a guardian in disguise. And that disguise worked perfectly, until the night the gang came. Because when the crowbar split his back door, when the quiet street suddenly shattered under the weight of violence, the neighborhood's harmless old man revealed himself. The watchman became the warrior, and the gang, blind to who he truly was, walked straight into the trap of underestimation. For the people on Maplewood Drive, the story that would spread in the days to come would shake them to the core. They would realize the quiet man who waved politely wasn't just a neighbor, he was the shield they never knew they had. Predators don't always choose their prey at random. More often than not, they look for weakness, for cracks in the armor, for what seems like an easy win. And on Maplewood Drive, the quiet home with the solitary old man living inside seemed to scream opportunity. The gang that chose Frankie S. house wasn't at the kind of sophisticated crew you'd see in Hollywood. They weren't master thieves with blueprints and laser grids. They were street-level opportunists, young, reckless, and dangerously overconfident. They called themselves a crew, but in truth, they were little more than a loose collection of misfits, bound together by desperation, arrogance, and the illusion of power. The ringleader was Marcus Slim Devereaux, a wiry 23-year-old with a reputation for trouble. Slim had grown up bouncing between broken homes, drifting from one bad influence to another until crime became less of a choice and more of a survival tactic. He had a sharp tongue, a short fuse, and an ego that could barely fit through a door. Slim had pulled off a few small-time robberies before, gas stations, corner stores, but nothing that made him rich. What he craved wasn't just money, it was control. The kind of control he never had growing up. Then there was Jamal, 19, the muscle of the group. Unlike Slim, Jamal wasn't cunning. He was broad-shouldered, heavy-handed, and always itching for action. Violence was his answer to everything. If someone resisted, Jamal hit harder. If fear didn't work, intimidation did. He carried a knife not just as a weapon, but as a prop. Something to flash for the rush of power it gave him. The third was Ricky, barely 18, and barely committed. Ricky had been dragged into the crew because he wanted to belong. He was the kind of kid who tagged along, laughed too loudly at Slim's jokes, and nodded along when Jamal talked tough. But behind the bravado, Ricky was scared. Scared of disappointing Slim, scared of being seen as weak, and most of all, scared of being alone. Together, they made a volatile mix: ego, muscle, and insecurity. And like most gangs of their kind, their worst enemy wasn't the law. It was their own lack of foresight. The idea to hit Frankie S. house came during one of their late-night hangouts in an abandoned warehouse where they gathered to drink cheap liquor and dream of fast money. Slim had driven past Maplewood Drive earlier that week. He noticed the quiet house with the single car in the driveway. No lights on past 10, no kids running in and out. To him, it screamed vulnerability. "Old man lives there," Slim told the others. "Probably got a pension, maybe a safe with cash. Easy pickings." Jamal grinned, twirling his knife. "Sounds like he won't give us no trouble." Ricky hesitated, glancing at Slim. "You sure about this one? Place looks clean, like, I don't know, maybe too clean." Slim shot him a look sharp enough to cut glass. "You scared, Ricky? Man's old. What's he gonna do? Call the cops? By the time they get there, we'll be long gone." The plan, or what passed for one, was simple. Break in after midnight. Grab what they could. Get out before anyone noticed. Slim's confidence was infectious, and Jamal's hunger for action made it feel inevitable. Ricky kept his doubts to himself. He had learned that questioning Slim only led to ridicule, and ridicule was worse than risk in their little hierarchy. What none of them realized was that their confidence was built on a fatal miscalculation. They saw age as weakness. They saw quiet as vulnerability. They mistook discipline for fragility, and that mistake would cost them dearly. On the night of the break-in, their arrogance was almost theatrical. They moved through the shadows with more swagger than stealth, convinced they were predators on the hunt. Slim barked orders in whispers. Jamal flexed his grip on the crowbar. Ricky trailed behind with nerves chewing at his stomach. What they didn't know was that Frank had already sensed them long before they touched the back gate. What they didn't understand was that every sound they made, every careless movement, was being cataloged by a man who had trained warriors to spot threats in far darker arenas. To them, this was a routine burglary. To Frank, it was a battlefield, and they had walked into his terrain. It's important to understand that men like Slim and Jamal weren't masterminds. They were products of short-term thinking, driven by adrenaline and impulse. They didn't plan for contingencies because they didn't believe they needed to. They assumed intimidation was enough to break any resistance. After all, who stands up to 3 armed intruders in the dead of night? But Frank wasn't just anyone, and the arrogance of that assumption, that blindness, was their undoing. Later, when police pieced together what had happened, they noted how unprepared the gang really was. They had no masks beyond thin scarves, no gloves to hide fingerprints, no real exit strategy beyond running back to Slim's beat-up sedan parked down the street. They were amateurs dressed in the costume of predators, blind to the reality of the prey they'd chosen. The tragedy and irony was that their lives might have been different had they chosen another path. Ricky, especially, wasn't cut out for crime. Deep down, he knew it. But in a group built on bravado, doubt had no place. And so he followed, silently hoping nothing would go wrong. But everything would. When they forced open the back door of Frank's house, they weren't stepping into a quiet home. They were stepping into a trap of their own making. Their mistake wasn't just choosing the wrong house, it was underestimating the man inside. Because while they thought they were predators, Frank had already decided they were prey. And in the minutes that followed, every ounce of discipline, every lesson, every instinct Frank had carried into retirement would come alive, not just to protect himself, but to remind them of a truth they'd never forget. Choosing the wrong victim can turn hunters into the hunted. Midnight draped Maplewood Drive in a blanket of stillness. The kind of silence so deep you could almost hear the rhythm of your own pulse. Inside Frank's house, the air was calm, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the quiet. But outside, in the dark, three figures crouched like restless shadows, every breath heavy with anticipation. The back door stood before them, a thin barrier between arrogance and disaster. Slim whispered sharply, his voice cutting through the night like broken glass. "Keep it tight. In, out, quick." Jamal grinned, adjusting his grip on the crowbar, and Ricky hesitated at the rear, his stomach twisting with unease. The first strike came sudden and hard. The crowbar smashed into the frame, wood splintering under the force. The sound echoed louder than they expected, ricocheting through the quiet neighborhood like an alarm in the night. Jamal winced, but swung again, the second blow shattering the latch. With a grunt, he pushed, and the door gave way. The house, once serene, now seemed alive with the echoes of intrusion. They stepped inside, heavy boots pressing onto the linoleum. Ricky flinched at every creak of the floor, every whisper of movement in the dark. But Slim, chest puffed with ego, whispered, "See? Easy. Old man won't know what hit him." What they didn't realize was that the old man already knew. Frank had been awake since the first scrape at the gate. His senses, honed through decades of discipline, had recognized the sound instantly. Intent, not accident. Now, as the intruders stumbled into his home, Frank stood in the shadows of the hallway, steady and silent, heart calm. He didn't rush for a weapon. He didn't panic. Instead, he watched, observing, cataloging, analyzing. To the intruders, the silence of the house felt like an opportunity. To Frank, it was a weapon. The men whispered among themselves, their voices carrying more loudly than they realized. Slim barked orders, Jamal's footsteps thudded heavy, Ricky's breathing betrayed his nerves. Frank took note of everything, the positions of their bodies, the way they spread out, the lack of coordination. He could see the cracks forming before they even realized they were exposed. Then, with deliberate precision, Frank shifted his weight on the floorboards. A single creak, subtle yet sharp, sliced through the air. It was small, almost insignificant, but in the charged silence of that moment, it was thunder. Three heads snapped toward the sound. "Who's there?" Slim hissed, his voice suddenly less confident. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. Frank stepped forward, not rushed, not frantic. His posture was upright, calm, his eyes steady. To the gang, it must have seemed surreal. An old man, standing unarmed in the dim light, as though he had been waiting for them. "Boys," Frank said, his voice low and even, "you just broke into the wrong house." The words cut deeper than any shout could have. Slim laughed nervously, trying to mask the flicker of fear in his chest. "Old man, you better sit down before you get hurt." Jamal gripped the crowbar tighter, flashing the steel edge as if to reinforce the threat. Ricky shifted uneasily, glancing between Frank and his crew, his nerves threatening to spill into panic. But Frank didn't flinch. He didn't back down. Instead, he took another step forward, closing the gap with measured confidence. His eyes locked on Slim, pinning him in place. "You think you're hunters tonight," he said softly, "but you've got no idea what kind of prey you've cornered." The stillness of his tone unnerved them more than a raised gun would have. Slim tried to chuckle, but it sounded hollow. "You don't scare me." Frank tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You should be scared, not because I'm angry, but because I'm not." That was when the atmosphere shifted. The silence of the house no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like presence. The intruders, who moments earlier had strutted in with confidence, now felt the weight of every shadow pressing down on them. The house, under Frank's control, became a stage where every creak, every pause, every glance tightened the noose around their bravado. Jamal, frustrated by the growing unease, stepped forward aggressively, crowbar raised. "I'll shut him up," he snarled. But his movement was sloppy, his anger making him reckless. Frank saw it instantly, saw the gap in his stance, the opening in his swing. With a speed that shocked them all, Frank stepped aside, his hand snapping out like a striking snake. In one motion, he twisted Jamal's wrist, forcing the crowbar loose, and shoved him backward. The weapon clattered to the floor with a heavy clang. The silence after that sound was deafening. Slim's eyes widened, Ricky's breath hitched, and Jamal, clutching his wrist, stared in disbelief. They had underestimated him. Gravely. Frank bent down calmly, picked up the crowbar, and held it loosely in his hand. Not as a weapon, but as a statement. His voice remained steady. "You brought chaos into my home, but here I decide how this ends." The silence that followed wasn't the calm of suburbia anymore. It was the silence of control, the silence of predators realizing, too late, that they were the prey. For the first time that night, Slim's confidence cracked. His voice, once sharp and commanding, trembled as he barked, "Ricky, get him!" But Ricky didn't move. His wide eyes were fixed on Frank, and in that moment the youngest of the crew understood the truth better than the others. This wasn't a fight they could win. The silence of the house had broken, yes, but only for the intruders. For Frank it was still unbroken discipline. He was the calm in the storm, and that calm was more terrifying than any weapon. For most people, a home invasion is chaos. Heartbeats spike, hands tremble, instincts scream to fight or flee. But for Frank, the moment the three men entered his home, it wasn't chaos at all. It was clarity. The living room, with its shadows and silence, became more than just a space. It became a chessboard, and Frank was already playing 3 moves ahead. Reading the room was second nature to him. It wasn't something he switched on and off. It was a skill etched into his bones after decades of service. He didn't just see the men in front of him, he read them. Every flicker of the eyes, every shift of weight, every tremble in the voice told a story. Slim, the ringleader, stood stiff with bravado, shoulders squared but eyes darting. His posture screamed confidence, but his gaze betrayed calculation. He was already looking for weaknesses, already worried about how quickly Frank had flipped the balance of power. Slim talked a big game, but Frank knew the type, a leader by intimidation, not by stability. If you cracked his mask, the others would crumble with him. Jamal, the muscle, was the easiest to read. His breathing was heavy, nostrils flaring, veins popping at his temples. He gripped the pain in his wrist like a fuse waiting to ignite. Jamal was pure impulse, a man who lived in the heat of the moment, not the logic of it. He'd strike first, think later, and Frank knew that meant he could be baited into mistakes. And then there was Ricky. The boy barely looked old enough to shave. His stance was hesitant, knees bent awkwardly, eyes flickering between Slim and Frank as though he couldn't decide whose approval mattered more. Ricky's hands trembled. Not enough to drop anything, but enough for Frank to notice. He wasn't committed. He was scared. And scared men were unpredictable but also persuadable. Frank took all of this in within seconds, faster than most people blink. To anyone else, it might have looked like he was simply standing there in silence. But in Frank's mind, the map of the confrontation was already drawn. The room itself became part of his analysis. He noted the placement of furniture, the edge of the coffee table, the sturdy arm of the sofa, the corner where shadows pooled deepest. Every object wasn't just decor. It was cover, a barrier, or a tool if needed. The crowbar he now held loosely wasn't a weapon to him. It was bait, a symbol that shifted fear from them to him without even needing to swing it. Then came the sound, the small, involuntary noises that most people ignored. Jamal's frustrated grunt, Ricky's shallow breathing, Slim's forced chuckle. To Frank, Each sound was a crack in the facade. He knew pressure doesn't break people instantly. It leaks through their words and their movements until suddenly the whole dam bursts. He decided to press that pressure, but carefully. "I can read you," Frank said calmly, his eyes locked on Slim. "You talk tough, but your boys? They're already second-guessing you." Ricky's head jerked, almost involuntarily, confirming Frank's observation. Slim snapped his glare at him, and that split second of tension between leader and follower was all Frank needed. Divide them, he thought. Control doesn't always come from strength. It comes from driving wedges. He shifted his gaze to Jamal next. "And you," he said evenly. "You think force solves everything. But look at your wrist. One twist, and I had you beat. Imagine what I can do if you push harder." Jamal's jaw clenched, his chest rising and falling with fury. The truth stung worse than any insult, and anger clouded judgment faster than fear ever could. Finally, he turned to Ricky, softening his tone. "Kid, you don't want to be here. I can see it in your eyes. You're scared. Scared for a reason. You know deep down this is going to end badly." Ricky froze, his lips parting as if to speak, but Slim barked before he could. "Don't listen to him. He's just trying to mess with your head." But the damage was done. Ricky's hesitation grew, his loyalty cracked. Frank didn't need him to switch sides. Not yet. All he needed was doubt. Doubt was as contagious as fear. The silence in the room deepened again, but this time it was heavier, charged with unease. Frank used it like a conductor holding a baton. He let the quiet stretch, forcing them to fill it with nervous movements and fractured glances. The more they squirmed, the more control shifted toward him. This wasn't new to Frank. He'd done it 1,000 times in interrogation rooms, in standoffs, in classrooms filled with raw recruits. Reading the room wasn't just about observing. It was about steering. Knowing when to let silence speak louder than words. Knowing when to prod, when to wait, when to move. And then, with deliberate precision, Frank made his next move. He lowered the crowbar to the floor, slowly, calmly. It clanged softly against the wood, echoing like punctuation. To the intruders, it was disarming, literally and psychologically. They expected him to cling to it, to posture like them. But by letting it go, Frank declared something louder than words. "I don't need this. You're not the threat here. I am." Slim's facade cracked further. His laugh came out forced, brittle. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just an old man." Frank smiled faintly, the kind of smile that unnerves more than it reassures. "Old men don't survive the lives I've lived without learning how to end things before they start." The room fell silent again, the kind of silence where every sound outside, the ticking of a clock, the distant hum of traffic, felt magnified. The gang had walked in expecting chaos they could control. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a silence that belonged to Frank. And in that silence, they realized the truth. This wasn't their stage. It was his.